Okay, awesome. Well, I guess I'm self-hosting a webinar, which is a little bit different. Thanks everybody for coming on a Wednesday night. Appreciate people tuning in to check it out. We're going to cover a few of the challenges as we see them around proposals related to the salmon allocation policy, a bit on background and history, and kind of a bit on a path forward. So, the goal here is really to help our members and the public and anglers and salmon conservationists kind of understand how we got here, where we're going, pieces of the policy and proposals that are from our perspective that aren't working for us and could use some improvement. So we're here to be hard on policy, not people. Of course, we want a policy that's fair and balanced. I'm going to kind of start off addressing one thing right out of the gates. Quite often, folks who are licensed anglers are referred to by the government of Canada and others as sport or recreational fit part, the sport fishery or the recreational fishery. For a lot of folks, including our members and a number of members of the public, fishing and being an angler is really essential to our identity. We give back to it, we contribute dollars, we volunteer. There's no substitution for fishing. If fishing is closed, it's not like we can go somewhere else and do something else. So from that perspective, it's not a sport. It's not like basketball or football where if your local basketball court goes out of business or it closes, you go somewhere else. As it relates to fishing, it's a part of our culture and our heritage that we hold near and dear. And so when you hear me talk about the public fishery, I'm referring to licensed anglers because we do represent hundreds of thousands of people in both the saltwater and the freshwater environment. And those people represent tons of Canadians, not only in British Columbia, but all across Canada. So that's kind of the preamble. The question is going to be, why we're here and where we're going. So first of all, the Government of Canada had a 1999 Salmon Allocation Policy document and a review that preceded that. That talked about, generally the order of allocation. And this is consistent with the world of wildlife typically, right? So Government of Canada, DFO is fish, and then wildlife is a provincial thing. But the order of allocation typically is going to be conservation first, right? We're supposed to take care of it and make sure that it's there in perpetuity. After conservation needs are met, priority is for Section 35 rights, food, social, and ceremonial. For First Nations, and then we have what we would call the public sector from our perspective, and then the commercial sector. And in this case, the commercial sector would be the commercial angling or commercial fishing, so trollers, seine, gill net, that sort of thing. And so that was kind of the way it was set up and structured in 1999, and that's the way it typically is structured in wildlife as well. We had a court decision called the Housing decision, which that ended up in court a number of times over the last, I would say, 20 plus years. I think it started probably in 2003. And so how has it kind of changed that order of allocation? And what the court said on a number of occasions is essentially as part of the treaty predating contact. And so how's it, basically talks about the 5 nations off the west coast of Vancouver Island. It said that those nations had a commercially based fishery that predated signing a treaty, and the treaty said that they had the right to live and kind of make a living the way they did pre-treaty and pre-contact. And so the Housing decision basically said, hey, Government of Canada, these nations had what we would call a rights-based commercial fishery, and you need to figure it out and find fish for that. And so that kind of has changed the order of allocation. So now, when you look at this, it's going to be conservation, First Nations, Section 35, food, social, and ceremonial, and then Indigenous rights-based commercial fishery. and then after that, the public fishery and the commercial fishery. And so that's what's changed. There's a few other drivers for the allocation policy review, but that is probably the biggest driver. And I guess from our perspective around it, how's it when we're talking about finding the fish for this fishery, this new fishery? From our perspective, we got to find the fish. So we have to figure out solutions so that we can honor, the decision of the court. And from our perspective, this is a commercial fishery. So by and large, those fish for this fishery should come from the commercial fishery. And so, kind of instead of taking that approach, the Government of Canada in 2018 started a review of the Salmon Allocation Policy to modernize it, to make sure or accommodate the housing decision. And there's a few other pushes underneath there too. One being that it hadn't been reviewed for a long time. And so the Salmon Allocation Policy has been in review now for whatever that is, 8 years basically. And then in December, the Government of Canada came out to the public and said, surprise, here we are 8 years later, and we have a bunch of proposed changes for the Salmon Allocation Policy. And you have a month, a month and a week, including Christmas, to provide your feedback for a process that had been running for 7 years. So that process too, for everyone's, knowledge, included members of the public fishery, so the Sportfish Advisory Board folks, who are a bunch of volunteers. It would include the commercial sector. It would have included First Nations representatives. Looking at the document, the public comment document, it looks like DFO was more of a passenger in this discussion, I guess a party that watched what went on as opposed to taking a leadership role. Anyways, 7+ years later, DFO came out and said, surprise, Merry Christmas. You've got just over a month to provide feedback on this process that could, result in some pretty drastic changes for a number of people who care about salmon and salmon fishing. And I think, there were a number of concerns about the lack of consultation, meaningful consultation to the public. And so they extended it to January 23rd. So, kind of a flag around the importance that Canada and DFO puts on public consultation. But that's how we got here, and that's where we're going. And so that public consultation went to January 23rd. What happens now is that the working group, so the groups that were involved in the last 7 years kind of discussions and putting proposals forward, they have to put some recommendations, I think, together for the minister by the end of the end of March here. And then the minister is going to have to make a decision. When? We don't know. So that's what gets us to today. Now there's kind of 3 really big concepts that we're concerned about. We could sit on here for 4 hours and talk about the Salmon Allocation Policy and what's in the DFO discussion paper, but there's 3 really big ones. Those are common property resources, the public right to fish, and priority access to coho and chinook for the public. And so, this concept around common property resources, we'll talk about that next, is an old concept, but essentially it's a very different perspective than what happens in a lot of the world. And the common property resource approach really means that in our case, resources like land, air, crown land, air, water, riparian zones, parks, wildlife, and fish are, managed on behalf of the public by the government. So the government, doesn't own these resources. These resources are actually owned by the public, and the government is only, responsible to manage them in trust. And so that, there's a bunch of challenges, but there's also a number of benefits that come under this, because when we think about Canada and we think about going out and doing these things like camping or hunting and fishing, a lot of the reason why we can do this is because those resources are actually owned by all Canadians, and they're supposed to be stewarded and shared, and we're all kind of communally responsible for them. Whereas you have other parts of the world where these things would be owned by royalty or owned by the government or owned by landowners or people who are rich or their friends. And so North America in particular has a very different model. So that's common property resources. The public right to fish, we'll talk about that flows underneath that. And then priority access to chinook and coho for the public fishery, we'll talk about that as well. So we'll take you back to somewhere around the 1200s, and there was a fellow back then by the name of King John, and King John, continues to have a pretty bad rap because he didn't seem to have much tolerance for his people, for his commoners, I guess we'd call them, and so he, would tax them, treated them very poorly. And one of the things that kind of brought this to a head is that, at one point he basically decided that he was going to privatize waterways, which, so that the king and his close people could benefit from that. So back then, a lot of goods traveled up and down rivers and across waterways. And so they were essentially kind of treating things like a highway for trade, and he decided that he was going to put a toll on this, and that he not only was going to put a toll on it, but that he owned it. They also ended up putting weirs on a number of these systems, which resulted in them monopolizing the fish supply. So they not only blocked navigation, they also essentially took over ownership of fish, and that created a whole bunch of problems for his barons at the time. I always want to call them lords, but it kind of stifled what was going on and created a whole bunch of hard feelings. And essentially what happened is the barons got so tired of this that they held his feet to the fire and basically told him he was going to have a mutiny if he didn't sign a document, and that document was called Magna Carta. And so essentially what came out of that is that, water and fish belong to the people, or the commoners, as opposed to belonging to the king. So you've kind of got this first pass around who owns these resources and why. That concept was further kind of codified or made a little bit bigger in 1217 through a thing called the Charter of the Forest. You can look all this stuff up. It gives you a really good sense of where we've come from and why we've gotten to where we are, and really what was going on behind the scenes. Is it wasn't, I guess, that people were intrinsically motivated to turn things over to the public. It was that they were more fearful of the king and how the king's powers were unending, and so they wanted to limit them. And so really that's where North America and Canada in large part are set up now as these common property resources. The public right to fish is also part of this conversation, and the public right to fish, really is more of a common law public right to fish that flows out of common property resources. And so that right, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the piece we should all be getting out of this is that if salmon belong to everyone, then there can be rights to people, including First Nations and the public, that flow out of that public ownership. If things like salmon or parks or wildlife or waterways or riparian areas are owned by private interests or by royalty, the public's ability to access those disappears, right? So if you don't own it, you can't access it. And so that's kind of the gist of where this ball started rolling, whatever that is, over 800 years ago. So a little bit more on salmon as a common property resource specifically, because Magna Carta gets us pointed in that direction. But salmon as a common property resource was actually identified in the 1999 Salmon Allocation Policy. And so in 1999, the government of Canada had literally 3 principles. That was it. And one of those principles was that salmon are a common property resource that is managed by the federal government on behalf of all Canadians, both present and future. And so that really puts the onus on the government of Canada to take a big picture approach to conserving, managing, and giving people access to salmon. So, the government of Canada only had 3 principles back then. This was one of them. The folks on the East Coast should also be concerned about this, because in the Atlantic Fishery Management Plan from 2004, it actually has the exact same reference put in it. And so I did ask some of the people who were involved in the 1999 discussions, where did this come from? How did it get put in? Who asked for it? And what I was told is that this principle, one of 3 principles, this principle was unilaterally put in there by the government of Canada. It wasn't something that other people said has to be in there. It was the government of Canada said, this is really important for us to demonstrate out to Canadians what salmon are and are not as it relates to ownership and who owns them versus who is tasked with managing them. So 26, 27 years ago, this was an extremely important thing for the government of Canada to say to Canadians. There's a proposal within the salmon allocation policy to remove that principle, and that really kind of strikes to the core of being Canadian, and it's something that a lot of people have taken notice of and have a bunch of issues with. And so that has been a talking point, I think, for people all over Canada for the last few months. And a few weeks ago, DFO silently edited their website and said, basically, don't worry, even if it's not in the policy, i.e. the reference to common property resources, salmon will still remain a public resource managed by the government of Canada on behalf of all Canadians. And those things, I think, the issue here is, why was this a principle, one of three, only three in 1999, that the government of Canada wanted to put in, and that the government of Canada put into the federal policy in the Atlantic in 2004, and now here we are 26 years later, and the government of Canada is saying, don't worry, even if we take it out, it still exists. It sends a bad signal out to Canadians in terms of this concept of public ownership. It sends a bad signal out in terms of oversight of both conservation and management of salmon to the public, and it sends a signal, I would say, to DFO as well, that they are not under the magnifying glass nearly as much as they would be with this principle in. So this is a really big issue. And it has come under fire, which I'll show you later, on more than one occasion. And until this date, the government of Canada was pretty clear on how it saw this. So that's common property resource side of it, how it came to be, and then the public right to fish, of course, is going to be tied back to common property resources. This principle actually predates Magna Carta. To a sense, it's really tied to tidal water, and where it got its origins was probably more from a place where, look, the ocean's a big place, we don't know what's in it, and so we kind of want people to go out and use it and fish it. But through time and through Magna Carta and interpretations in both Canadian and BC common law, the courts have said, there is a public right to fish. And that right to fish is a common law right to fish. It is not the same right as Section 35 rights, but that it is still a right. And there's a whole bunch of pieces that have even happened over the last 100+ years, or even 100 years, where we've had immigrants from other countries who were able to access fisheries because of this approach, when Canada and British Columbia were probably not acting in a manner that they would act today. Aboriginal rights are also rooted in Magna Carta under right to fish. And this right exists for Canadians, and it's something that we believe is very important. Even though it's not the same rights, we think it's really important to reflect the public right to fish in the Salmon Allocation Policy, and the Government of Canada doesn't seem to have any interest in putting that in the document. And so on that one, the question is why. The leading piece is, why are we talking about taking common property resources out of there to send a signal? And the next piece is, why are we not talking about the public right to fish in the Salmon Allocation Policy? Because it's really important to Canadians. So a little bit more on common property resources, just to illustrate that this isn't the first time we've started going down this road. One of the examples was in 1847, so pre-Confederation here. The British Colonial Office, this is back in the time of the Hudson Bay Company, lots of talk about colonizing Vancouver Island, and the bureaucrats on the other side of the globe decided that they wanted to move all fisheries around Vancouver Island to the Hudson Bay Company. Literally just wanted to say, here, this is yours, you can have it. And so, we're moving away from this concept of common property resources rapidly. We're moving into the privatized model, where it's owned by someone, and people who get to access it are either friends, family, or the wealthy. And Queen Victoria in the end ultimately said, no, this is a really bad idea. This is not the direction that we want to go. After I'm sure a lot of lobbying and debate and discussion, not too dissimilar to today. And part of the decision, she said every freeholder will enjoy the right of fishing all sorts of fish in the seas, bays, and inlets of or surrounding the said island. And so, what this example shows us is in the not too distant past, 170 years, someone got the idea that we should privatize fish. And had that held around Vancouver Island, our world and our ability to go fishing and to conserve fish and our connection with fish would be dramatically different than it is today. And so that wasn't the only time that something like that happened. In 1913, 1914, the government of Canada actually had to go after the government of British Columbia, because part of what happens in the world of land management, it's no different today, is that the province owns riverbeds and seabeds. So they're the land manager, the land owner. This is no different than if we talk about national parks or marine protected areas, by the way. It's a really important concept. It's going to be a really important concept going forward. But the province basically took the position back then that we own the riverbeds and the seabeds, therefore we own the fish. And we want to take these fish and we want to grant rights out to interests, to individual companies or peoples, and we want to lease them. And so they basically wanted to treat fish like land. And so, the province was taking the position that, hey, we own what's underneath it, so we own what's above it in the water, and we want to be able to lease it off or sell it off. So again, looking at this privatized model and moving away from common property resources. The courts ended up siding with the government of Canada, said that fisheries are not private property. The public right to fish is real. BC cannot grant exclusive or preferential rights to individuals and exclusive rights. So essentially the privatized model would require clear legislative authority. We hear that a lot, or competent authority or regulations to change it. The message around this business of common property resources and the public right to fish is that this is not just about fish. It's not just about salmon. This is about access to water, access to navigable waters, to rivers, to creeks, to lakes, to wildlife, to parks. North America is a very special place in the world, and the reason why we get to do what we do and access the places we do is because of this concept of common property resources. And it's very tempting for governments to go down the rabbit hole of converting common property resources or converting crown land to private land because it means a quick buck. But for the rest of us who enjoy nature, it means that what we do and why we live in British Columbia could disappear very rapidly. So as much as we're talking about the Salmon Allocation Policy today, people have to have this in their mind going forward, because as we're seeing and what we can see in history is that these things are not guaranteed, and that they can come at risk fairly quickly. So the message is DFO right? If they remove common property resources from the policy, will it disappear and will it go privatized? No, they're absolutely correct. It's not, but they're sending a really bad signal out to every single person in Canada to say, we're looking at this and we're looking at pulling it out of policy after 26 years, where we unilaterally said that one of our 3 principles was in fact this principle and it had to be in the policy. Okay, so that's common property resources, public right to fish. Then the third one that we talked about was priority to Chinook and coho, particularly for the public sector. What does priority mean currently? So a few things that some of you are going to be really surprised by. As it relates to pink, chum, and sockeye right now, in the current salmon allocation policy, it says that at least 95% or higher of the catch available goes to the commercial sector. Now, this is after conservation and after First Nations Section 35. What's left, 95% of those 3 species, a minimum, is supposed to go to the commercial sector, and 5% or less goes to the public sector. So that's what priority, that's how it's defined for those 3 species. And in part, some of it makes sense because these species tend to move through pretty quickly. They're through in a matter of weeks or a month. They kind of move past fishing locations and get into rivers fairly quickly, whereas Chinook and Coho are around more often. But it's usually really eye-opening for people in the public fishery to see that 95% of those are dedicated, or a minimum of 95 are guaranteed for the commercial sector. So that's the definition of priority under sockeye, pink, and chum. Under Coho and Chinook, the way that works is that priority to directed fisheries for the public fishery are on Coho and Chinook, and that the commercial harvest only occurs when abundance permits. And so what that means in effect is, where the public fishery doesn't use what's left after conservation, food, social, and ceremonial, then there's a commercial harvest on that. So these 2 definitions are very different, and how they're applied are very different. And so the big concern right now is that there is a push to move to shares on Chinook and Coho. So shares between the commercial sector and the rec sector, and that that scraps the concept of priority under our world. And why shares make this really challenging versus the current definition of priority is that there are a bunch of mixed stock fisheries in BC, and a bunch, especially where things are managed, I'd say intensively down south, like on the east side of Vancouver Island, where we have mixed stock fisheries where there's runs and returns of populations that are not doing well. And so in those populations, we're going to have things like maximum exploitation rates, which are low. Like we can only harvest or have mortality on a certain percent of these returning fish. And the 5-2 fish, which are the early, most of them are early long migrators in the Fraser, are always a DU that we talk about in terms of conservation. And so in our world of the public fishery, there's a whole bunch of things, tools that we have so that we can allow people to go fishing for, months, a month, or more than a month. And, the tools are going to be things like, hatchery only fish, mark selective fisheries, catch and release fisheries, slot limits, like we have on the inside of the Vancouver Island, and then also fishing in rivers. And so what we can do is we can try to set up regulations that try to minimize the impact on some of these fish, i.e. the 5-2 fish, where we can still catch some of the other fish that are of different age classes or different returns, like 4-1 fish. And so that allows us to lengthen our season. If we go into the world of quote unquote shares, what that can mean for Chinook and Coho is that these weak stocks, we can end up with, if we open up like a commercial harvest on these fish, you end up with a bit of a race. Like commercial fishing happens more efficiently, much more efficiently. They're not like us where it's like, I want to go for a week in August, but on one day I want to go, hang out at the campsite. The other day I want to fish hard. Maybe we'll go into town. Commercial operators like to operate really efficiently to minimize costs. And so if we end up with commercial openings on mixed stock fisheries where we have low exploitation rates, it is very easy for us to clean up those those stocks that have low exploitation rates, because it's really, really, really hard to be selective on these commercial fisheries. And so what can end up happening is if we move away from, if we get rid of this definition of priority for Chinook and Coho, and we move to shares where there's mixed stock fishing, we will rapidly end up in a place where the openings will likely be very short, days to weeks, and they could also be very unpredictable based on how fish move through the coast. So it gets really complicated really fast, and it gets very, very, very unpredictable. And so for a lot of us who, book our August long weekend or our July long weekend or our favorite week to go to the coast, that can change very rapidly if we end up having unselective harvest with high exploitation rates in mixed stock fisheries. And so that's why this is a really important priority to maintain for the public sector, because the world changes rapidly if we go into the world of shares where we have mixed stock fishing. And so, I'm going to talk a little bit about how, the priority of at least 95% or more go to commercial sector and how it works on sockeye. But it's also going to be a bit of a cautionary tale about mixed stock fisheries and how we can have big impacts on everybody because of non-selective harvest. And so, Fraser River sockeye from 2025 is a really great example of how that works. So what happened last year was, I think we forecasted, I can't remember, 2.7 or 3 million fish were supposed to come in. So it was like, okay, very limited FSC harvest. No one else is fishing. That's fine. Things aren't looking great. So we got to put conservation first. What ended up happening is we ended up with 9 million fish, like way more than anyone predicted or expected. And I think, quite frankly, no one was really planning for that or thinking about it. What ended up kind of happening under there, though, too, is, so now it's like good news. We have a lot of fish. We had problems. There's essentially three kind of runs. There's the early run, there's a summer run, and then there's a late run. And so the early and the lates were kind of the constraints. So what happened last summer was it was a matter of trying to figure out how we can avoid these early fish and these late fish, because we don't want to have high exploitation rates on them, which would close the fishery. So it's like, how do we focus in on the summer fish, right? So I guess first thing is, this is really good news. There's lots of fish around. The second piece is how do we figure out how to fish them sustainably and selectively so that we can allow for kind of maximum opportunity and to get people out fishing. And, the effort that was required with 9 million fish to get a fishery opened last year for the public fishery was monumental. Like, it was unbelievably challenging, in part because of the policy, in part because folks at DFO were misinterpreting the salmon allocation policy, and in part because we had a mixed stock fishery. And so what ended up happening is, by the time everybody realized there were tons of fish, at the mouth of the Fraser, there were a bunch of late fish, which, weren't doing great and had a low exploitation rate, a max, I think, of 10%. And the summer fish were all mixed together. And so, based on what was in the IFMP, the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, we couldn't exploit a lot of these lates. And so it meant that we had to think about places to go fishing that were not where all these fish were mixed together. And so for us, as the public fishery, we can move, right? So we could have moved to the mid-river or to the lower river, and we flagged those opportunities a number of times with the government of Canada and said, look, right now there's, millions of free fish in the mid-river. There are no late fish around. We can go out and fish sustainably without having an impact on any of these, stocks of concern. Let us go. And it didn't happen. I'm sure there were all kinds of politics and challenges behind the scenes that we didn't get to see. But it took a long time to get it open. When we finally did get it open, it was, I think, 11 days in the freshwater environment and maybe 5 days in the saltwater environment. And, as it relates to our impact as the public fishery on Fraser River sockeye last year, there were about 1.39 million mortalities out of 9 million fish between test fisheries, the United States fishing, Section 35 fisheries, commercial fisheries, and the public fishery. Out of those 1.39 million fish that were caught and killed, the public fishery accounted for 70,000 of those. So 5% of the total harvest. We, quite frankly, are decimal dust in that equation. Our harvest is so low that it's hard for DFO to even see or measure when we're on the water, other than going and doing creel census and seeing fish on the beach. they don't really know that we're there. The benefits of that fishery last year were tens of millions of dollars in economic expenditures. In terms of conservation, just to conservation and enhancement, just to the Freshwater Fisheries Society of BC, the direct dedicated license revenue for the freshwater side was over $1 million for an 11-day opening. So extremely low impact, ability to be very selective and to move so we can avoid mixed stock fishing, and the economic return of that is huge. The commercial folks, by the way, were definitely not happy about how things went last year and probably should have had more opportunity even at the mouth because the late fish came in a lot higher. But the point of this conversation is, if you move to this model where it's 95.5 and it's very specific, it means openings are not predictable. You don't know when things are coming in. You can't plan it. Openings are very short because like last summer, if we had the lates in there, if we opened things up, it would last a few days and we'd be over the exploitation rates on the lates and it would be closed. So that's where, priority access to Chinook and coho are so important for the public fishery. And if we head down the road of shares, our world most likely changes dramatically. So hope everybody got the point. The percentages are not a big deal in terms of coho and Chinook. The important piece is maintaining that priority piece. We have to stick to that because if we go down the road of shares, the world comes unbuttoned. But people always want to kind of ask, what is it? Who harvests what? Last year, the preliminary data, just writ large in terms of harvest, we were around, I think 12.4% was the preliminary data. So the public fishery harvested around 12.4% of all the fish that were caught. What this graph shows is the percent of recreational harvested, so that means the public fishery, harvested salmon in British Columbia compared to the commercial harvest. And so when you look at these lines down here, that's chum, pink, and sockeye, and it's very low. Right? And so we know from the policy that the commercial sector gets a minimum of 95%. And so our share we would expect would be really low, less than 5%. And it is. But on the flip side, even where we have priority, the public fishery has priority to Chinook and coho, when we look at the harvest here, what we see is that over time, since about 2002, on average, the commercial sector still harvests the majority of the coho and Chinook. So even though our definitions of priority in both cases are very different, the commercial sector, on average, they're going to harvest nearly all of the sockeye, pink, and chum, but most years, in the past in particular, as it relates to coho and Chinook, they're harvesting the majority of the fish. So in our world, moving to a shares-based model for coho and Chinook gets rid of priority as it stands. It moves us to probably unpredictable timing. We can end up with very short openings, and at this stage, the commercial harvest, is more than the public harvest writ large. So that's kind of the priority piece. The good news is, in the world of the public fishery, is we believe that we have a culture and a heritage that's something to be proud of, right? So fishing, licensed angling in British Columbia contributes $1.3 billion in economic expenditures, $643 million in GDP, 9,100 jobs across the province of British Columbia. It is the most sustainable. It is the most selective. It contributes the most per fish in terms of the economic side. It contributes the most per pound, puts the most into conservation. It is the only dedicated funding mechanism for fish conservation, restoration, and enhancement in British Columbia. There is no other dedicated fund that goes in. And that was from public fishermen and anglers and fisherwomen putting up their hand and saying, we want to pay taxes. We want you to tax us. And we want it to go back into the resource. And so when we let people go fishing, salmon benefit directly from dedicated funding. The other thing that the public fishery brings in a big way is legislation and regulations. So things like the Wildlife Act and the Fisheries Act, those things are often championed by the people who care most. So First Nations, public fishery, commercial folks are going to be in very large part the reason why there is legislation and regulation that protects fish and fish habitat in Canada and in British Columbia. It is not because there was some kind of epiphany that happened in Ottawa or in Victoria, quite frankly. It would have been from people on the ground saying what is going on is not right and we need to change it. Public fishing also results in donations and volunteerism all over the province. Our membership alone is 300,000 hours a year, plus that go into conservation and stewardship. There are people running hatcheries and doing conservation projects all over the province because they started salmon fishing somewhere. And so a really great example, these 5'2" Fraser fish, which are not doing well, they impact fisheries all over the coast. There's folks up in Prince George, the North Thompson, the Spruce City Wildlife Association, who's a BCWF member. They spend all of their time running the hatchery, doing conservation projects, bringing in donations, volunteering. There's a bunch of First Nations that work on those 5'2" fish. Those people who are working on 5'2" fish will never see an opportunity to go fishing for those fish. Not in their lifetime. It's not going to happen. They will not get an opening up there. The fish are not doing well. The reason, though, why those people are giving back is because they care about salmon. Because the people in Prince George go out to the Skeena River or go out to Prince Rupert, go to Kitimat, or go to any one of the systems, even the Babine system, and they went and they caught a salmon and they had a relationship with salmon and conservation, and they live in Prince George and they said, I want to give something back to fish. So, you know, with a very, very, very low impact and a very low proportion of the harvest, this is what the public fishery gives back to fish, to Canadians, and to the economy. And so, you know, if allocation goes and we end up in these places where we start shifting gears towards a quasi-privatized model, or we start giving up on this concept of common property resources, or we start moving allocation, we end up with really short openings that no one can plan, where people are stacked up and we're hitting exploitation rates on weak stocks and mixed stock fisheries really fast, opportunity disappears. And we know that when opportunity disappears, spending disappears, which means jobs disappear. Anglers will disappear in the long run. The dedicated funding that comes in from license sales disappears. The volunteerism and the donations that come in all over the province from one end to the other to do fish habitat work, conservation work, running hatcheries disappears, and ultimately fish disappear. And so there's a relationship between everybody who care about fish, and in our case, the public fishery, who spend their time thinking about dedicating, giving back to fish, and in a number of cases for people who are not going to be able to get access to those fish. Interior Fraser steelhead is another one. And so there's going to be a ton of you who are online sitting there thinking about things like habitat loss, conservation, all of the recent announcements around funding and the job cuts that are happening at DFO. The fact that it appears DFO is walking away from these 5'2" fish, even though they're not doing well, and it results in a whole bunch of chaos in fisheries. But for the Salmon Allocation Policy, you know, this discussion is not about science or conservation, it's about politics. It's a policy document, and there's a bunch of things in that policy document that we don't like, that do not acknowledge Canadians, their contribution, that do not acknowledge the history around common property resources and why this model is so important in North America and in Canada, and why we do not want any kind of signals that we're moving in a different direction, that the public right to fish, even though it's a common law right, and it is certainly not the same as First Nations rights, is important to us, and why priority for coho and chinook has to remain the way it is. And so, you know, now we look ahead. and think about what the world looks like. And for a lot of us who are on this call, we're doing this because we love fish and we're willing to give our money to fish. We're willing to buy licenses and pay more money. I know all of you on here would take the government of Canada up and double your salmon stamp charge as long as it went into conservation. And ultimately, we want our kids to be able to go out and get the opportunities and experiences and the connection with salmon that we do. So, if these things are of interest to you, looking ahead right now, this recommendation document is supposed to go to the Minister of Fisheries March 31st. We are going to continue to engage the public, to have town halls, to talk to anglers and Canadians and stream keepers and hatchery operators all over the province about this issue for the foreseeable future. But if you want to have an impact right now, I would say get a hold of your MP before March 31st, organize a meeting, tell them how important salmon are to you, to your culture, to your heritage, and what you want to see in this policy. Send a letter or call the Minister of DFO and make sure that she knows your perspective as well, and don't stop. This is a big issue that has major potential impacts on us. Remember, be hard on the policy and on the problem, not on people. None of this is personal. It's about trying to figure out a way through this so that we end up with a policy that everyone can see themselves in, that take care of fish and ensure that everyone has a future to go out, access fish, and take care of them. So Philippe, I guess we turn it over to questions now. I'm usually watching questions in the comment box. So I'll stop sharing my computer, and if folks have questions, we can dive into those.
Yeah, we got a few open questions here.
Okay, I can pop up the window here. Will you provide a succinct summary? Include the southern resident killer whale. Okay, so thanks, Darren. For this one, we're not sinking in on southern resident killer whale. We can definitely get you information. If you go to fishingrights.ca or the BCWF website, all the points are on there for sure. Absolutely, I appreciate you reaching out. And the southern resident killer whale is definitely a hot topic. Right now, we are putting our energy into the Salmon Allocation Policy because these documents can live for 25 or 30 years, and we're really concerned about what could happen here and kind of the direction we're going. Who owns the commercial fishery and where do those fish go? Local, BC markets, or elsewhere? Okay, I'm not the subject matter expert. The fishing licenses, I've got a neighbor who's a commercial fisherman. It varies. I think what you're probably getting at is who owns the processing. That is a big commercial outfit. Where do they go? I believe that something like 75% of the commercially caught fish are exported out of Canada. You showed a graph that says recreational catch of coho and Chinook is around 75% recreational plus commercial. So I don't hear that commercial fishing is the villain, and how much is the First Nations piece? No, the graph shows we've got the halfway line, and so what it shows is that on average the commercial harvest of coho and Chinook is more than 50%. That the public fishery on average over time is less than 50%. The last couple of years it has trended up for sure. And the First Nations piece. No, the First Nations piece, the Section 35 harvest is not in there. That comes right off the top. And so this ties back to the concept of the priority piece as it relates to both chum, pink, and sockeye for the commercial sector, and then the difference around how priority is outlined for Chinook and coho for the public sector. What can we do to advocate for our rights? Great question. So this is really getting a meeting with your MP and explaining how important salmon and your connection to salmon are, right? That's the first piece. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of benefits that come out of the public fishery. Getting a meeting with your MP, spending a half hour with them so that they really understand how important this is going to be your first best bet. And the second one is to get a letter out to the minister. And I will say too, for folks, don't use a boilerplate copy and paste. It has to be personal. Otherwise, people are going to ignore it. So talk about your relationship with salmon because it's really important. A lot of the MPs, they're just seeing this now. It's kind of been behind the veil for 7 years, this whole discussion. And so it's going to be new on a lot of the MP's desk, and they're trying to get up to speed and trying to understand what it means and how we figure it out. So, focusing in on your MP and on the minister is really important to get your point across. And again, focus on the problem, not the people. Nobody needs to come over the top ropes on an MP or on the minister. They're in listening mode, and so we have to tell them how important this is. Given the economic impact of the BC economy, is the provincial government doing anything to fight for this? The province has put out letters and has engaged the government of Canada on this, just stating the importance of trying to find balance. Does BCWF have sample letters available for us? Yeah, so yes. So again, go to fishingrights.ca or to bcwf.bc.ca. We also have a Tell Your Salmon Story. For your letters, again, make sure that the first bit is about your connection with salmon, not just a copy and paste, but all the information is available on the web. Absolutely. What percentage of Chinook and Coho are they actually proposing? There's no actual proposal for that, which also sends alarms. But again, this piece around the existing policy where it says Chinook harvest, commercial harvest occurs when abundance permits, that is central to maintaining, because if you go down the road on this, even if it's 5% and we go out and have a non-selective fishery where we end up with a whole bunch of 5.2 fish, the world closes rapidly. And so that's the real threat in all of this, is that the way this is set up on both ends works pretty well. And if we go down to the world of shares on Coho and Chinook, same with Coho, right? So a lot of it is catch and release unless it's a clip Coho. In some of these fisheries, that are not selective, you can chew up a lot of unclipped Coho very quickly, which could run you into overages pretty quick and end up with closures. Okay, share the rally information on March 21st. Yeah, I don't have the website, but Ian, if you want to put it in the Q&A, I think it's salmonrally.ca. Put it in the Q&A and it will pop up. We are doing more town halls. It sounds like there's going to be one in Campbell River April 11th, and we will have some more. For the commercial fishery, what methods are used and how selective can it really be? Well, yeah, and so it depends on what kind of fisheries, right? So you have seine fisheries, gill nets, and trollers. The trollers tend to be, they're far more selective ability, like in terms of catch and release and mortality. The other methods, gill nets are, they're super, 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 super high mortality. Seines can be too. The rates depend on the study. Gill nets, I think Pacific Salmon Commission uses like 1-for-1, I would say, and I think they lump seines in with gill nets, but seines are going to be lower. I don't know what it is, 60 or 70, and then trollers are going to be somewhere around 20, 25, something like that. It depends on the study, but they're not, not nearly as selective. Thanks. How can we get this out to the greater community for support? How can you get it out? Get it out on your social media, engage all your friends and family, send your letter out, CC them, get them involved. There's been tons of turnout at the town halls. There's been people that have been writing op-eds as well, which is awesome to see. Just the more that we can talk about it, the better. And again, in a nice way, like this is a policy issue and we have things that we're advocating for that we think are really important. So social media allows everybody to touch dozens, if not hundreds of people. So using your social media as a vehicle for communication is really important. Are fish caught by the commercial Aboriginal fishery included in the total commercial catch? The answer on that one for that graph is no. Is there a federal fishing petition that we fishermen? Yes, there are multiple. There are multiple petitions being circulated in Ottawa by various MPs. You can just Google them, Salmon Allocation Policy petition. There's a bunch on the go right now. Remind people that letters to your MP don't require a stamp. That is a very good point. They don't need a stamp if they're going to the minister. And for folks, we will be at the BC Outdoors Show this weekend as well, and we do have some postcards. A quick plug for the folks who get Island Fisherman, you will be getting postcards in your Island Fisherman magazine as well. But again, I want to stress like the personal touch. We always say like, copy and pasted letter in an MP's office gets you this much. A personalized letter gets you this much. A meeting with your MP gets you this much, right? So that one, ask for the meeting, get the meeting. For the other ones, i.e. the Minister of Fisheries, definitely a personalized letter is really, really important. Is there a rally? There is I think a boat rally, which someone else will post. I don't think there are any rallies planned right now, but this will continue on. And the folks who are organizing, there's a bunch of fisheries organizations all working together. They're listed on our website. Everybody's working collectively because we all see that this is a really important issue. And so there will continue to be more awareness, more town halls, more discussion. What is our collective response to the ultimate restrict and remove our right to continue fishing? Yeah, Tim, that's a great question. We are trying to focus all of our energy right now into making what we think the right decision easy. So we're putting all of our energy into getting, what we think is a good policy, an appropriate policy that represents the greater good as it relates to the public interest and to salmon conservation and stewardship. So I don't have a good answer for you. I think we just right now we focus on moving through this and putting our best foot forward. How does bumping the public down the priority access list impact our ability to fish beyond the three big concerns? Yeah, Simon, we could be on here all night. We could spend hours going through the discussion document. I would highly recommend you pull up the discussion document and have a look at some of the other proposals. There's a lot of nuance in there. These are the big three that we've identified collectively as being, I would say hills to die on. But have a look at the DFO discussion paper on the salmon allocation policy. Are any of the proposals going to change zone regulations and opening or closures? Well, it depends on the policy, and so that's the challenge is the rubber doesn't hit the road until the policies change and then the policy's interpreted. And so the answer to that is it varies, and it's going to depend on what's going by with some of these concerns around mixed stock fishery. For the east side of Vancouver Island, like it's already highly limited slot limit, one fish a day. I think it opens July 15th now. If you end up in a place where a bunch of 5.2 fish are being non-selectively harvested, for folks on the east side of the island, wouldn't surprise me if you're not open till September. It really wouldn't, but we don't know because we currently have priority for Chinook and coho. So if we open commercial fisheries, there's a really good chance that things go upside down. Is there a plan if things don't go positively? No, not Sarah, not right now. That's the next step. Right now, we're just going to continue to focus on this and continue to talk to everybody, the public, MPs, minister, provincial government. We have people engaging city councils in BC. There's a whole bunch of small communities that really rely on fishing here in British Columbia as well, and I'm sure they're engaging their MP. Brian, you're asking which MPs? I would say the best advice is reach out to your MP and to reach out to the minister. If you want to take one step further, there is a committee on fisheries and oceans called FOPO. You can send an email to that entire committee that has MPs from coast to coast. That's not going to hurt you. It's one more step, takes a little bit more digging. If you want to do that, that is the icing on the cake if you want to take the next piece. Isn't it important to put a quota on all the allocations? Yeah, so Alice, I wonder if you're trying to say a limit, and there is a limit, right? And so we do have a limit. Conservation is always supposed to be first. We could argue that on Tier Fraser Steelhead, and certainly there's lots of arguments where DFO has not put conservation first. But theoretically, conservation is supposed to be taken care of right out of the gates. And if conservation is not taken care of, no one gets to go fishing. What is the reaction from other provinces? Well, we've engaged. Yeah, we've engaged a number of other groups, and certainly this discussion around common property resources has people spooked. Like for the government of Canada unilaterally put that in 1999 and say we have only three principles and this is one of them, and it needs to be very clear in this policy. And by the way, we're going to do this on the east coast of Canada as well. And for them to come back now, whatever, 26 years later, and say, well, we don't actually need it in the policy. There's a number of other provinces, including in central Canada, who are shaking their head at that that perception and that discussion. They are not keen. I mean, this ties into the North American model of wildlife conservation, which is not ingrained in our laws, but the concept is that the government holds things like crown land, fish and wildlife, water, access to lakes in the public trust. And so when we look at this and the government of Canada saying, well maybe it's not that important, and same on the right to fish piece, where it's like yeah, the SFAB thinks it exists, but we're not really going to acknowledge it. The other provinces are not impressed by that approach at all. So I think we've got. Oh no, there's more. Here we go. Can you make Zinfandel available to the group? Yes, absolutely. New app, yeah, it'll pop up. Thanks, Jerry. It will pop up for everybody. They can all see the questions. Okay, awesome. Derek, thanks for the response. Philippe, are there any questions coming in on Facebook?
There's no more questions from Facebook, no.
Okay. Okay, folks. Well, look, really appreciate you taking an hour with us. This is really important for not just salmon and not just salmon fishing. This concept strikes right to the core of being Canadian. The idea of common property resources is fundamental to everybody, and there's benefits that all of us have accrued because a long time ago, a king, made a lot of bad mistakes, and as a result, every single person in Canada benefits from this concept that these are public resources. So appreciate you coming out. Please engage your MP, get a meeting with them, send a letter to the Minister of DFO. If you live in the Lower Mainland and you're going to the BC Outdoor Show, come see us this weekend. We'd love to talk to you. Don't give this up. Get it on your social media. Engage your friends and family. Check in on our social media regularly. There will be more town halls on the island. There will be more town halls. I think we're going to do one in Smithers as well in April. So keep at it. Thanks for all of your time and have a great night.